Welcome, everybody. Always good to see you, and thanks for joining us for today's session. It's going to be collecting and reporting feedback to improve learners' academic and employment outcomes. We're very excited to have Megan Elyse Williams joining us again. Y'all probably remember Megan from the December 2023 session. And joining her is Rachel Whilby from CSW as well. And they'll be leading today's discussion. I am going to start with a quick intro. You see the agenda for the meeting here. So Rachel is a research associate at CSW, and she supports the Workforce Benchmarking Network and data initiatives across the other teams. She has an extensive experience in K through 12 education, has worked in the classroom at the administrative level, and with the Department of Education in New York City, working on research-driven initiatives and improving student outcomes. And we're very excited to have her here and introduce her to y'all. And then, of course, Megan, who is the Director of Research and Evaluation here at CSW. She leads the research and evaluation efforts across multiple national initiatives and has a background in social policy and evaluation. So again, really excited to have them here today. A lot of what they will be talking about addresses some things that you all have asked for more support in implementing. So we're just really excited about being able to talk about that today and do that. You probably saw in the reminder email that went out yesterday for the meeting that we were going to spend the first 15 minutes of the meeting to just do a check-in. So before we start the actual presentation, we want to acknowledge, as we did in our email, the recent Dear Colleague letter from the Department of Education that came out last week, and the challenges it may be presenting for your institutions, in addition to other policy changes and executive orders that have come out in recent weeks. We wanted to assure you or reassure you that CSW remains steadfast in our commitment to advancing economic mobility for learners and supporting all of you and helping you navigate the policy changes that have been happening. So to check in with y'all, we do have the feelings wheel, which we introduced at our last meeting. And we want to use it to help us to reflect on how things are impacting us, how the changes are impacting us. So you have it here. Feel free to drop a word in the chat. It might be multiple words, honestly. It's definitely multiple words for me that best captures how you're feeling about these policy shifts where you are. And you're also free to share, come off mute if you would like to share more about how you're feeling. And we really just want to allow the space.
Great. Well, thank you for the wonderful introduction earlier, Diamond, and the segue there, Jenny. Rachel and I are very excited to be here and to share with you some of what we've learned and experienced and found successful with collecting qualitative data and feedback to improve programming. And I think kind of coming out of the last conversation, what we can do is we can listen. And this conversation is around thinking about tools that can help us listen, document what we're hearing better, and think about ways to use that in our future work and strategy of programming. So I think hopefully it will be a natural flow. But just as we go through, if you have questions, please come off mute, raise your hand, put them in the chat. We will have time at the end for questions as well. So just a little bit of pragmatics there. But if there's anything that you're really eager to say or share, please let us know as we go. Next slide, Rachel. Okay, objective. So today, Diamond shared a little bit, and so did Jenny, about what we're here to do. So just before we jump right in, want to just kind of reset what we're hoping to cover with you today. We want to take time to identify where qualitative feedback could strengthen our program planning and strategy. We want to discuss ways to collect feedback and ensure meaningful responses. And we want to explore best practices for reporting feedback to your intended audiences. So we hope to get through all those hefty objectives during our time today.
Sorry, very difficult to navigate the multiple screens and find the Zoom controls. Hello again, everyone. So to get us started with this portion of today, we wanted you to get you started thinking about what qualitative data collection, if any, you already might be doing. So if you've participated in a waterfall activity before, anyone? If not, I'm going to describe it anyway. What a waterfall activity is where you're going to type your response into the chat, but you're not going to hit enter. And then I'm going to give you about 90 seconds to do that. And then I'm going to have everyone hit enter at the same time so we can just see the cascade of everyone's responses coming in at the same time. And then we'll review some of those. So again, the question is, what type of qualitative data do you collect, if any? And some examples might be through student focus groups, employer conversations, or something like that. So again, we're going to put those into the chat, not press enter yet, but jot down some ideas of what activities you may already do. Awesome, seeing these all flowing in, let's take a moment and look at what others have said. Let's use our emojis. Is it something that resonates with us? Is it something we're curious about? Maybe putting a question mark. If it's something that you'd love to do and you're really curious how someone else does it, maybe putting some validation for that person as well. But let's look at what others, what each person has shared. So we have employer conversations, advisory board meetings, pre and post surveys, tutoring, focus groups, faculty interviews, student success stories, coaching sessions. Great. So one of our intentions behind doing this activity was both for us to learn from each other and see what others are doing, but also to kind of call attention to how some of that qualitative data collection is already organically happening in your some of the daily strategies you may have, or some of the regular practices you may have. And then for us to start to think about how can we more so formalize some of those things or be able to better report out on that. So thank you for participating. Again, continue to drop things in the chat if they come up. I'm going to hand it back over to Megan.
Thank you, Rachel. Thanks everyone for sharing. That was really informative to see all those examples. So now we're going to get to talking about why we're here, which is qualitative data and its benefits. But before we do that, we just sort of like to ground ourselves in the types of data overall, what those include, and then how we see them working together. So there are two types of data. I'm sure for many of you, this is a refresher. There's quantitative data, which, as you can see on the screen, are data that can be that's usually represented by numbers, can be counted or measured. And this data is usually secondary data or data that is collected by someone else or provided to you. And then there's qualitative data, which is what we're here to discuss today. And these data are usually descriptive information that needs to be interpreted. And it can really help us understand the whys and hows, especially of what we're seeing in quantitative data. This data is usually primary or data that you collect firsthand. So it takes more skill, more time and resource to use it, but it can be extremely beneficial. We think of qualitative data as really important in helping us better understand the context of the quantitative data that we have access to. And for example, we really use this data to sort of try to understand patterns that may emerge or help us pinpoint our underlying roots or themes or causes to kind of what we're seeing in the quantitative data. And so we see them as working hand in hand. Qualitative data allows us to ask questions directly from the source. So we can say things like, what challenges are industries, employers facing in our region? What do career pathways and preparation look like in our region? And they're really key at helping us kind of get at things that the quantitative data alone won't tell us. So for example, upping recruitment to a welding program won't address a worker shortage if the real problem is that the program isn't teaching the skills that your region's employers need, and quantitative data won't tell you this. So next slide. So we typically have access to quantitative data for learners. I think many of us who are in educational institutions, we collect a lot of quantitative data, usually around some of these key learner touch points, application, enrollment, their time during the program, around completion and then around employment. But we see, and while we see those as really valuable, we see qualitative data as being a place to kind of extract or understand more about these key touch points for quantitative data that we have.
So again, as Megan kind of already alluded to, there are definitely some advantages for why we should consider collecting qualitative data in addition to our quantitative data. It is necessary for that meaning making. When we have that qualitative data, it brings those numbers to life. It can reveal some nuances of experiences that quantitative analysis alone cannot. It can also lead to future quantitative data collection. So for instance, when you perhaps ask questions in an interview or in a focus group, and you might learn something about a data point that is not currently being collected, that maybe this is something that you should consider collecting in the future. So again, it could lead to new questions, and really good research always does lead to more questions. So it could lead to new questions and other data points that you want to consider collecting in the future. It tells a story that engages multiple parts of the brain, right? So when we're just looking at numbers, we know that not everyone's a number person, just like not everyone may want to read the long story or hear the long story. It's the ability to be able to have both of those things working hand in hand to both be able to add a little bit of color to those numbers that you're seeing, and then be able to reach a wider audience by, activating more parts of the brain for different people. And then hearing directly from those with that lived experience will greatly advance your understanding of the issue at hand. So again, it's adding more to the why behind what we're seeing, or how what we're seeing is being influenced by what the initiative may be, or the program that we're implementing. All of those different pieces, it's just very important as an additional piece to add in the qualitative data alongside the quantitative. We're not saying one over the other, right? We're saying that the two really work hand in hand in complementing each other. When you think about qualitative data, you can think about it as using data storytelling. And again, you can evoke an emotional response on a neural level that can help points be remembered and acted upon. So sometimes looking at numbers, like looking at data points, isn't enough to create that or evoke that emotional response that makes someone want to do something with that information, right? That qualitative data is going to add that color to that story to hopefully make it more likely that we will then act upon whatever strategy, whatever change, whatever new initiative, whatever it is that needs to be implemented to maybe see a shift in those numbers. And the last thing that I'll say on why qualitative data is that because stories matter. We each have a story. Our stories frame how we see the world. No two stories are the same. Hearing more stories lead to creating a balanced story. Sometimes it's important for us to step up and tell our story. Sometimes it's important for us to step back and let others tell their story. We are more than data points or a statistic, and we're here to challenge stories that start in the middle. And again, without collecting that story, you don't have that richness to be able to really see what's behind the data that you're looking at when you're speaking about quantitative.
Okay, so we've been talking a lot about why for qualitative data. Now, what are the different types of qualitative data? You all shared a lot of different examples in your work that you already used, which, as we mentioned, was really helpful to see. There are some pretty common types of qualitative data at collection activities that typically people use. They include interviews or one-on-one conversations, focus groups or community roundtables, and open-ended surveys. Each has its own advantages and disadvantages based on the time it takes to conduct them, the skill it takes to conduct them, the resources needed, or the access someone has to the tools to conduct these different types. And so really it's just important to really think through what is the purpose of your data collection, and then identify which of these activities will make the most sense for it. Interviews and focus groups are excellent when you need more detail, but they take more time to conduct, more skill to analyze, more effort involved all around. Interviews are also preferred over focus groups when the material might be sensitive, or you might need more detailed feedback from one person to understand their experience. Then an interview makes sense. Focus groups are great for getting feedback from multiple people at once, especially if they're from the same constituent group. And sometimes it's really helpful for people to hear others respond to focus groups, and especially if they might be reluctant to participating or nervous about participating. So focus groups can go a long way in those situations. But when you do focus groups, you need to really consider the power dynamics in the room and be thoughtful about that. As noted just a moment ago, it can be really helpful to make sure that your focus groups are with key constituent groups versus, you wouldn't want to have a focus group with students and instructors in the same focus group. That might make it very hard for someone to share what they need to share and what you need to hear. Surveys are helpful when you're trying to collect a greater volume of data. They are easier to analyze. Sometimes you might be using tools too that come with tools that help you do that analysis. And so they're a great resource for that. However, it can be harder to recruit people to take your survey, and you need really thoughtful and intentional outreach to make sure people aren't going to ignore it or just move past it, right? And so we'll talk about that in a little bit too. Next one. So what qualitative data should we consider collecting? There are many, many different types of qualitative data that might be useful to you in your work, and want to hear about those in just a moment. But some of the different qualitative data that can be really important to consider in our work or consider expanding to in our work include feedback to explain questions you have about your quantitative data or explain and contextualize challenges that you've been identifying or running into in your work. Feedback to confirm or challenge your current programming and strategy. Even where you might not know that there's a challenge that's emerging, it can be helpful just to get feedback to know, is what I'm doing still the right thing for today's climate, for today's context, for today's employer needs, etc. So it can be really helpful to have touch bases, even if you're not expecting anything, but just to kind of confirm that we want to keep moving forward with what we're doing. It can be very helpful to have constituent feedback to support the co-creation of strategies to address any challenges or gaps that you've identified. So it can be important to collect feedback, not just about what are challenges or perceptions or things, what are things going well. Of course, don't want to always go in with a negative mindset for the data, but it can also be really helpful to use qualitative feedback to get ideas or strategies and to have those you serve or those you work with help invent with you what are the next steps, what makes sense going forward. It's really important to have qualitative data to expand on your organization's metrics, including any equity metrics that you have. Again, just to give a little bit more detail and context for what you're seeing and why, that can go a long way in using that storytelling that Rachel talked about. And then it's really important to have baseline data across all learner engagement points that we showed earlier. I'll show it again in a moment, just to really understand experiences. And again, this might be prompted because you really do need feedback, or it might just be important to do those check-ins every once in a while and just make sure, are we on the right track? How are people feeling today? Where could we do things differently? Like we said, feedback can be collected across the spectrum of learner engagement, including prior to enrollment or application, as well as after completion. I think sometimes those are touch points that get lost. It's much easier to capture data from students when they're with you and maybe on your campus, depending on where you sit and how you serve learners. But it can be really informative to try to hear from those who might not even know they could be prospective learners for your institution, and then to hear from those after they've left your institution to understand what have their experiences been, have they been able to apply the skills they learned, where are their chances to maybe augment what you offer to better meet today's needs too. And so just wanted to note that it can be really important to kind of look across the entire spectrum. Okay, so who should we collect data from? Certainly we heard a lot of examples earlier about who we can hear from. Who you speak to should really be driven by the need of your feedback. And so you want to make sure you are thinking about what your question is and then who is best suited to give you feedback on that question. That said, you really want to prioritize your feedback to address any critical gaps in context and understanding, especially around student outcomes. and if there are priority populations that you really need to hear about a certain issue too. So here's some high-level examples of who you might want to hear from. But again, it will be really important for each of these high-level examples to think about if there are segments within these populations of learners, students, employers, et cetera, that are really critical to be represented in any feedback that you collect. And so the first one, so of course, it's important to hear from learners, prospective learners, alumni, and those who didn't complete their programs about their experiences, instructors too. We want to hear from employers if that's relevant for the work that we do, not just our key employer partners, those that we typically go to, but are there other regional employers that are really critical to the industries you serve in the region you sit in, or are there employers in new and growing industries? And we need to start looking to the future and thinking about what their needs are. So being very broad and thinking about the employers we can hear from. I saw a bunch of you put employer feedback into the chat, so I know you're already doing that. Community members are constituents. So many of our institutions serve a region, right? Or we serve those beyond just those that we are actively engaged with, are enrolled. And so we want to hear from others in the community about what they think about our institution, if they have or haven't considered our institution, why or why not, what barriers there might be that exist that prevent people from considering us as a service to them. And along that same vein, it can be really important to hear from partner community organizations and nonprofits, especially those that sit in workforce, student support organizations, or social service organizations. They have participants that could benefit from, if not your learners. And so it's really important to hear from those organizations, any barriers that they've identified that their populations they serve face, and any context they can share with you as you think about developing future programming and future student supports too.
I'm going to pause this for a moment, and we seek feedback as well. So even if you do not have something new that you want to add to the list, if we could have a heart or a thumbs up if what Megan has just shared is resonating between who we should collect feedback from, what types of qualitative data we should be collecting, some kind of something so that we can know, are we on the right track? Feedback. So thumbs up, hearts, anything.
And you can
or
tell
question mark.
Rachel is a former teacher, which is very obvious, and I am a social worker. So our approach to gathering your feedback really represent our professional backgrounds. Well, now we're going to practice. So we've talked a lot about theoretical data that we could collect. Of course, you've shared examples of the data that you have been collecting. But now we want to take some time to practice sort of thinking about quantitative data and what questions we might have that we could use qualitative data to support us in answering. So asking all of you to take 5 minutes to think through and write down. So take a look at this college scorecard data example from a sample school. It's on socioeconomic diversity. And so in this chart, you can see for this sample school, the percentage of students who received an income-based federal Pell Grant intended for low-income students. And so using this prompt from the sample school, think about, write down what questions does this chart raise for you? Who might you want to talk to better understand more about this school's socioeconomic diversity? And what activity would you use to collect this feedback? And then when we come back together in 5 minutes, I'll see if anyone wants to come off mute or put in chat any of the questions or thoughts that they had. Okay, so now we want to talk about what can we do to strengthen our qualitative data collection. And so the first thing that we like to do for any of our data collection, qualitative, quantitative, anything we're doing with research evaluation, is to ground it in culturally responsive best practices. Culturally responsive research frameworks are really helpful in ensuring that we are designing and interpreting qualitative data with the right considerations, especially when we're working in communities that we are not part of. We all work with communities, whether they are defined by certain constituencies, physical locations or regions, or tied to identities. A relevant community could also just be the student body that you serve too. So there's lots of different ways to define communities, but each community has its own values often, cultural thoughts too. And so even if it's not, we can think broadly about communities, right? And when we are out there trying to collect data, especially qualitative data, we need to start with trying to understand who are the communities we need to hear from and what do we need to know about those communities to do this work in a very thoughtful, intentional way. So listed here are some of those important considerations from these frameworks. And then we have a lot of resources at the end of the presentation as well for those of you who want to dive deeper into this. So just to start with, we want to make sure that any data collection we do, especially qualitative data collection, is representative. We want to think about how we're building that representation. And so a way to do that would be to, depending, of course, on the feedback you're looking for, but what is most relevant? Is it important that we understand the regional demographics in the area to try to understand what's representation? Is it important that we understand our institutional demographics to do that? But what do we need to uncover from the quantitative data to help us make sure that our qualitative data is going to help us hear from those we most need to hear from about any given issue? And then we want to ensure that those methods reflect the community's cultures and values, just as we mentioned before. So we want to think about what activity we're picking, and then does that activity resonate? Will that work? What makes the most sense for this community and the level of feedback we need, the type of feedback we need, and how we're going to get that feedback. And then we want to be very thoughtful in our protocol design as well. So we want to ensure that we're being very accessible and inclusive in how we design our questions, and that we are including consent processes if those are needed, depending on the population that we're collecting data from. And we want to make sure that we're really thinking about the questions we're asking. Is it using jargon that I understand? What is it that I am intending to understand, and what is the best way to frame it or phrase it for those that I'm hoping that will answer it? And a really important way to do that is to co-develop the questions with the learners or whoever it is that you're hoping is going to partake in the research, and then to test it if you can. If there's a way that you can have those that you're hoping will participate test it before you move forward, that can be a really important way just to make sure that you're framing things in a way that can be understood. And then facilitation, you want to be very thoughtful about how you're going to actually facilitate this data collection. And that can include identifying appropriate facilitators. So you want to consider facilitators' identities, roles, and connections to the learners and workers. Certainly, if you have a focus group, you might not want to have an instructor facilitate it, right? Because it's probably not going to be thoughtful about the power imbalance there or how comfortable a student might feel in sharing information. Same with if it's someone from leadership, are they going to feel comfortable or able to share the information you really need to hear? Be careful about how for the facilitator, be careful about how the facilitator shows up and presents themselves, and make sure that they are being respectful and mitigating bias. So how we show up, how we dress, how we communicate, how we are closed off, or there's many different ways we can make someone feel in a space, especially a focus group or an interview where that can be really face-to-face interaction, even if it's not in person, right? We still have to pay attention to how we're showing up, the intentionality we're putting towards that, and the space that we are designing that would allow someone to, again, give that information that we really need to hear. And then if possible, it's really important to compensate those that you collect feedback from, especially if they're students, community members, workers. We really want to honor their time. There might be, of course, if you're working with an employer partner or someone on staff, it might not make sense to do that. But when possible, it's best practice to compensate people because they're giving you their expertise. And it's really important to respect that. When we're moving into analysis, we want to identify, again, any needed cultural context when interpreting the data. We want to take that time to, again, think about how we're showing up and our frameworks that we're showing up with, our perspectives and our experiences, and how that's shaping how we read other people's words. So again, during this stage, it can be really important to involve the community in interpretation or have a representative help you during the analysis phase when possible. And then in reporting, you again want to make sure you're using accessible, considerate, appropriate language when you are reporting back any information, and you want to cite necessary context. So if you're talking about inequities that are rooted in systemic racism or systemic sexism or other barriers, then you want to call attention to those. Otherwise, the reader might mistakenly put the reason for inequities on someone else, and that could be really inappropriate. And so there are tools later on in the presentation, if you're not familiar with that, about how to do that. But that's another really important part when you're reporting out information, is just thinking about the context and how you're setting up this information. Disseminate the findings to the community that participated if able. This is really a best practice. It's not always possible, but there might be a way to share out a one-pager or something that's not as detailed, just again to show them that you honored their contributions. Those contributions are being used right and shared back out. And so that's an important thing to think through. And then of course, like I said, ensure those findings are used. Don't waste anyone's time. If someone's going to share feedback, of course you have to think about, is that representative? You don't need to redesign your whole program because one person said something, but you do need to make sure that if you're hearing something, then you're moving forward with that information. That's really critical to being ethical, not just culturally responsive. Okay, next slide. So ways to increase response rate. Some of them reflect what we just talked about, compensating informants for their time and contribution. That's a really big one. Another way is, if this is in person, to provide food or beverage. That's a good practice just in general when you are bringing people together, to make sure that they can access water and other basic needs, but providing food and beverage can also be a really good way to increase response rates, especially if you're working with students. And then conduct outreach through partners or other trusted entities. So not everyone will know you or what you're asking or why you're asking, or they might not trust you. But maybe there's a student group, or maybe there is a student serving organization or some other organization that does have the trust of that community that you're hoping to hear from. And if they understand and can buy into what you're doing, then they can do that case making for you. So that can be a really important strategy. You always want to explain to anybody, no matter who they are and what data, no matter how informal it is, how you're going to use that, and ensuring that people understand that and can agree before they agree to talk to you or share anything with you. And then not exactly the same, but again, ensuring those participating can access results. This can be, especially if you are talking to partner organizations or others, you're maybe including others who really want this feedback, then letting them know they're going to get it will increase their buy-in and commitment to participating too. That's been a big thing for us in our work, is like, well, will I get access to this if I connect you to my participants? Will I also get access to this if I participate, or I connect you to so-and-so? So that can go a long way too. And then of course, choose accessible feedback, formats, locations, and times. Can people get to where this is if it's in person? Is the time appropriate for all different schedules, workers, student schedules, any different schedules that you need to consider? So a lot of times when we're doing focus groups, we offer different times across different days, just to make sure that people would have some way to participate no matter what their schedule might be. Okay, next slide. Okay, and then just a few other considerations. So I probably should have said this at the start, but these are best practices for collecting qualitative feedback. There are more considerable protections and practices needed for qualitative research with a capital R. So again, this is really to think about what feedback you need and how you can use that feedback. If you're trying to write a journal article, then of course you'll need to make sure that your research follows other practices and protocols. As I mentioned before, be very clear up front with those you're speaking about the purposes, the uses, and the reporting, and the confidentiality. There are times where choosing to make research or feedback confidential could be very important to increasing your response rates. So for example, students, does it make more sense to make sure that no one's going to know who they are when they respond? But there are times that won't make sense. For example, maybe you're trying to make it clear that you did get feedback from a really critical employer in your community, or a really critical trusted partner agency in your organization, and you want people to know that. And so that's fine, but they need to know how you're going to use your information. Are you going to directly quote them? Are you going to mask it? So those are all things to consider. And then, of course, make time and prepare for how you will develop those protocols, not just following the culturally responsive practices we just mentioned, but are they questions people can answer? Got to do a good job writing those questions. Otherwise, analysis is going to be really, really hard. So it's just something to think through, like, how am I asking this question? If I'm going to ask that question across different constituent groups, again, how am I asking it in a way that will let me do some summarizing at the end? So it's important to think about how you ask your questions and kind of look forward to think about how you're going to analyze them as you're doing that. Make time for conducting that outreach. We already talked a little bit about that, but outreach often doesn't go as planned. So it's good to give yourself a long window, understand when your reminders are going to go out, who you're going to go to if they need to send reminders, what is your backup plan. So it's very important to save time for that outreach, because it takes longer usually than we anticipate to get people involved, especially when people are really, really busy. And then prepare for how you're going to document feedback. Are you going to record? Are you going to transcribe? Are you going to just take notes? Are you going to ask someone else to join and take notes? There's benefits and limitations to each of those options. But if you're going to record, then of course, again, need to let people know that ahead of time before they agree to participate. And then you want to recognize contributions. So certainly we talked about compensation. That is best case scenario if you can, but also, especially if it doesn't make sense to contribute, someone like an employer or another trusted entity, are you going to follow up with a thank you? Are you going to follow up once your research or whatever is concluded to let them know the next steps? Like, there's many different ways to do that, but it's important to recognize people's contributions and keep them in the loop as it makes sense for whatever it is that you're doing. Okay, handing it over to Rachel.
All right. So Megan certainly noted some of these things as best practices to be culturally responsive. And I'm going to just further reiterate some of those things. I want to start by saying this might not be the scientific way of describing it, but I consider it a research trap. When you think to yourself, when I have people in front of me, let me ask them everything. Let me throw the kitchen sink at them. You want to try to avoid that, right? So instead, one of the first things here is that you want to identify what topics you would actually be covering. So, sorry, we're going to start with survey and questionnaire development first. You want to, again, identify what topics would you actually be covering in your survey and kind of be as intentional and streamlined as possible to keep a theme in the way that you are asking those questions so that it's around that one topic. As Megan noted, being collaborative and iterative. So that might be working with colleagues, it might be working with peers, it might be testing it with that constituent group and doing kind of like, again, some beta testing before you launch that survey to a larger group. You want to use open-ended questions sparingly. So especially in survey items, again, we really love to get that detailed feedback, but surveys are already very challenging to be completed, but they are far less likely to be completed when there are a lot of open-ended items. So you want to be very strategic about how many open-ended items you use, and maybe also usually trying to keep those as optional, even if you want to make some of your other items a requirement to be answered throughout the survey. You want to also be thoughtful about the closed-ended questions that you ask. So how many options are you providing? You want to be inclusive as much as possible if it's, for instance, a list of services that they may have received while on campus or something like that. So you want to try to be as inclusive as possible. If it's something around identity and you want to make sure that there are many options as possible. However, trying to maybe add that other option, and that could be a place where people can add things in so that it's not a long scrolling list, especially everyone likes to do everything on their device. Again, survey response rate declines dramatically when people have to do too much scrolling. So just keeping that in mind. You want to also be thoughtful about the order of the choices, be consistent and strategic. For instance, if you're doing degrees of agreement or degrees of satisfaction, that those are consistently going from most agree to least level of agreement, your yeses always before your no's, whatever the order is, you want to just be consistent in doing that. Ask what you mean by being clear and specific. It's called like double barreling a question sometimes, you know, like where you're asking two things at once. Try to simplify your questions as much as possible so that you are consistently just asking one question that you are trying to have people respond to. And again, that's the asking one question at a time piece. So we're going to practice this a little bit. And we're going to go back to our visual here. So we're going to take a few minutes and draft a few survey items that could answer a question about this data. And you can, again, think about any of your potential constituent groups that you might go to. Some of the things that people said in the chat was their institutional research office, undocumented populations within their community, the registrar, DEI offices, families, instructors, or other internal or external stakeholders. So just thinking about any of those groups, what might be some survey items that you could draft? And again, keeping them to closed items, yes, no questions, degrees of satisfaction, agree, disagree, or things that might be a select all that apply kind of item. Interview and focus group questions, and what are some of the strategies for effective questioning for interviews and focus groups. First of all, we want to think about that when we are coming up with these questions, we want to make sure that we are generating, our questions are also generating curiosity in the person who we're asking the question of, so that they feel interested and invested in the conversation and want to share with us. It stimulates that reflective conversation. It's thought-provoking. It surfaces any of our underlying assumptions. So this also goes back to some of what Megan might have shared as terms of, or in terms of as the interviewer, what might be some of who you are that you need to kind of surface before you enter into that space, to make sure that you are checking those assumptions and you're checking your parts of your identity as well before you enter into that space. It invites creativity and new possibility. And as we mentioned earlier on, good research always evokes more questions, right? So you're going to come up with new things that are very interesting for you that you want to pursue. There are about 6 question types, so we're really going to focus on 4 of them today that you can use for interview and focus groups. There are open questions, which gather information and facts, and those usually have probing questions that go along with them, where it might be, if the interviewee does not naturally begin to answer some of these things that I know I would like to know about, what might be additional probes that I can give them to gain additional detail. There are hypotheticals where it suggests an approach or introduces a new idea. And then there are reflective questions that check for understanding. And we're going to walk through each of those. Okay. So for time, let's think about open and probing questions. So on the right, this is an example of from a focus or interview that our team has done before. The question on top is our open question. Please share more with us about implementation so far and what has been achieved in your region. And then underneath are these probing questions, where they get to some specifics that if the individual did not answer these things, we can ask them more specifically. What are the successes? What are the hurdles? What else hasn't gone as planned, right? So that's getting to a little bit more detail. So we're going to practice, okay? And again, looking at our data, we're going to take a few minutes to draft an interview or focus group open-ended or probing question that could answer a question about this data. So again, these are our how questions, our why questions, our please describe, please identify, things like that, with how we would ask these questions. Hypothetical question type, the reason why I do like this one is that it kind of like opens the doors of possibilities to an individual. So sometimes it might be that someone is thinking that they're very much constrained by whatever they assume the rules to be. So, you know, a question might be, if you could get additional funding or resources, how might that help? So there's could be questions, again, things that you could ask of a student, things that you can ask in administration, community members, whatever it may be, again, to kind of open up, where can we take things next? Because now we've kind of removed those limitations. And then the last one, we're not going to do that. The last one is reflective. And this one's hard to do in the abstract anyway, because it's usually repeating back to the interviewee something that you heard, just for clarification's sake. So again, so would you prioritize the most critical areas for attention first, and then make sure that everyone knew what was most important, right? So that might be based on something that the interviewee said earlier in the interview. You're trying to get more clarifying information to just get more information from the person at that time. Okay. We can think about ways to improve our active listening. We want to avoid interrupting the speaker, listen to understand, not to judge, focus on improving our positive nonverbal behavior, maintain eye contact. Again, we're asking questions, avoid other distractions, and provide feedback that show that you are listening and engaged in that conversation. Okay. And then moving on to how to strengthen our analysis and our reporting. So there are some important considerations for our data analysis. You should certainly do self-reflection throughout the process to recognize and try to mitigate your bias. We've talked about this quite a few times already. That's very important for whoever's doing the analysis to make sure that they're checking some of their own identity at the door as they're looking at that data. When reporting and sharing that results, articulate your position and subjectivities, what your worldview, perspectives, and biases are, so the audience can better understand the filters through which questions were asked, the data was gathered and analyzed, and the findings were reported. So we'll also talk about this a little bit more on the next slide, where it is just kind of thinking about what was your methodology and needing to include some of those pieces as well. Start to think about things that could be pursued in subsequent interviews or focus groups. So again, good research breeds more research. Identify topics, issues, similarities, and differences that are revealed through the participants' narratives and interpreted by the researcher, then identify those themes. And any conclusions drawn should be supported with direct quotations from the participants. So Megan also noted you might not necessarily change your whole program based on one person's feedback, but that there may be something that needs to be taken from that to make sure that more questions are asked about that topic. And if there is something that is contrary to everything else that you're hearing, you again might want to use direct quotations to make sure that that's effectively communicated. And then lastly, meaningful reporting. You want to always revisit the purpose for gathering your feedback in the first place, and you want to center that so that, again, you're avoiding that, that pitfall of trying to talk about everything all at once. Remember your audiences and tailor your reporting to be accessible to your varied constituencies. So if this is going to multiple different groups within your community, that you're making sure that it's accessible to each of those constituent groups. Present your methodology by clearly stating who is included in the data you're reporting and how. And similarly, who's not included? Who could you not hear from? If you had the intention to speak to instructors, but they weren't available, if you had the intention to speak to employers, but they weren't available, you also want to make sure that that full picture is being captured as well. And that could be in your limitations and your areas for future investigation, and then provide action steps for carrying this information forward. And Megan noted earlier, we are not talking about capital R research here, right? This is what's going to be practical for internal use. And so we couldn't actually really even find examples of feedback reports, because typically it is for internal use, right? So it is not necessarily just going to be like publicly available, but again, just to think about what's going to meet the needs of your community and, again, your intention for doing the feedback work in the first place. All right, I'll hand it back to you, Megan.
Yep. So thanks, everyone. That was the bulk of our presentation. Time went by really quickly. Just for your sake, when this gets sent back out, there are resources at the end of the presentation for you to take a look at if you want to just quickly bounce through. There's a couple of different resources about the importance of qualitative data and using learner feedback, resources on how to do that. And then there are some of those culturally responsive research resources that I mentioned as well. I know we're right up at time. So unfortunately, we won't have time for questions, but we really do appreciate all of your participation and feedback throughout the process. And Rachel, if you go to the next slide, then I think it's the next, oh, then the next slide. So you'll have, oh, and we got to fix Rachel's email on there. You'll be able to reach out to any of us with questions after this. But with that, I'll pass it back to Diamond.